The Brooklyn Nets and the Philadelphia 76ers are about to give us potentially one of the biggest NBA regular season matchups in recent history. We're going to talk about how the Sixers have looked with James Harden, whether or not this is a must-win game for the Brooklyn Nets, and how it will impact their playoff picture going forward, all coming up right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo.
Oh, yes, it's the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. Over there is Doug Norrie, owner-operator DFSR, for all your daily fantasy sports rankings, DraftKings, FanDuel. He's got you covered. I'm Adam Marbeck, breaking down the New York Football Giants offseason on the One Giant podcast. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day, free on all those great platforms, Doug, and off of a big, pivotal, critical win against the Charlotte Hornets. Right back into what could be one of the more exciting matchups when you still have 16 games to go in the regular season. Brooklyn, Philadelphia, James Harden, Kevin Durant, Ben Simmons, Kyrie, Embiid, the whole thing, man. It's all in front of us here on a Thursday night tilt.
Yeah, I was thinking about this after we got off the pod yesterday and just kind of ruminating on it on Wednesday as well. And just thinking about this game has to be one of, and you can see it in the title, has to be one of the most intriguing regular season games that is not, and like sort of high leverage in a weird way at regular season games ever. That wasn't a final game of the season or like the last two games where where they're jockeying for playoff position. I can't imagine. I could not think of one specifically. Now, sometimes playoffs kind of like on a year-to-year basis, the playoffs will sort of like overtake whatever your memory is of like a big game, right? Like the regular season goes away and then it's the playoffs. And that's kind of how you end up remembering seasons to some degree. But in terms of just straight up storylines, intrigue, the teams that are meeting, the timing of it, because of like where each of these teams are in the season, the sort of the newness of the rosters, which we're going to get into all this stuff and more. There's plenty more here. This has to be. I'll make a prediction right now. I don't you ever care about ratings because I think I said this yesterday. Like, who cares? But because if you want to watch it, like, it doesn't matter if other 1.3 million other people watched it. Like, I just never understand that. But for context, I'm going to predict that this game will end up being the highest rated regular season game for the NBA this year, and I suspect it won't be close. Just because of all the stuff we're going to talk about and a few other logistical things that are going on with it, because this is, if you're the NBA, this is like legit every single thing that you could ever want from a game.
No, and when you talk about, well, first of all, make a note of it, friends. Receipts on that one. I think it'll prove out to be right because you mentioned as well. It's on TNT, nationally televised game. It kind of hits the time slot where it will be the only one tipping off in that time. So,
by the way, no, it's not the only one tipping off. It's the only one. Like there's only two games on Thursday night, and that's the only game that's going to be on at that time. So you won't even get like RSN stuff cutting into it. There won't even, if you like basketball at all, your team is not even playing. So like, unless you're a Sixers or Nets fan, other than that, in addition to like the Harden stands that are out there and the Kyrie stands that are out there, and like just like the way the NBA exists in terms of fandom now, there won't even be a reason to click on, like Hornets Raptors if you're in Toronto or Charlotte, just as like, or whatever. Like, it's just going to be the only game on the schedule.
Yeah, and the other, so we mentioned inside of this, we're talking about 16 games left to go in the season. Usually, that end of the season, are you in or are you out impact is a big factor here. The Brooklyn Nets, coming off of an enormous win, the 50-point performance from Kyrie Irving, you absolutely needed it. Now it's like trying to contextualize what this game means against one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference. It does feel different in that regard. Obviously, it's going to be a high leverage game for both teams, but coming off of losing against Tatum and the Boston Celtics, not having Ben Simmons yet, even though he'll be there on the bench with the Brooklyn Nets, it's going to be interesting to me to try to analyze this game and its outcome, knowing that the Sixers are the fully formed version of themselves, while the Brooklyn Nets are still building towards that. I'm sure it's not going to matter to Sixers fans or anyone that wants to analyze who's good or bad or what it means in the grand scheme of things. But there's both like the immediacy of this game and the impact it has on Brooklyn, and then over the next 15 games thereafter.
Oh, for sure. Like, we already have a good sense of what the Sixers team is with Harden. We have some stats that are just going to kind of pop off the screen or through your speakers here. We'll get to those in a little bit because they are sort of alarming if you are a Nets fan based on how good it's been. But in terms of just like understanding what these two teams bring into it before we even drill down onto the player level, which I want to do, I think we both want to do like in sort of earnest, because even on a player level, this is sort of unprecedented what these two teams are bringing. Just on a high level, what, in addition to just being the only game and all the intrigue, like we saw it already in that Hornets game. This is going to 100% have a playoff vibe to it. No doubt in my mind. The crowd is going to be absolutely bonkers. Like the Philly crowd is beyond pumped about what's happened with this team right now. They have a legit MVP candidate in Embiid who might frankly win. Their team has been ridiculous since getting Harden. They wanted Simmons out the door, blah, blah, blah. But in turn, like we saw it from Charlotte on Tuesday, where they were playing that game like a playoff game, hacking Drummond at the end. Like that was a game that, I know the Nets ended up winning by a lot. Like they fought really hard that entire time. They could have rolled over many times during that game when they were down, huge at halftime. They stormed back on the, in the second half. But if that game is going to be a proxy for what we said about how teams are just looking at the Nets in general, this game is going to have such playoff intensity just around all the other stuff that's happening in the stadium with the players that I think we'll be able to take away certain things. And like I would say the Sixers have the definitive advantage because like you said, the team is a more realized version of what they are going to be down the stretch here. Sure. Because the Nets are without Simmons. But I think just on a higher level, like I think kind of that won't matter to start because I think the intensity is just going to be so just through the roof. Like I never get crazy about games, like intensity around games, because again, I don't usually care. I kind of just care what happens on the court. But this is one has me sucked in around all the other stuff.
And everyone's already been saying, quiet game for Kevin Durant. You said it last episode. Like there's, I'll put it as close to 0% chance that Kevin Durant comes out with a performance similar to what we saw against Charlotte with Kyrie doing what he was doing. But then you're talking about having Embiid. Let's just leave it at Embiid and Harden and Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. Like you could get 4 all-time performances inside of a single game, whatever the outcome ends up being. But you could have 4 players that go for 30 plus or go, have monster nights, have season best games. Maybe Kyrie Irving could feasibly try to top what he just did against Charlotte, all because you're going to get that level of intensity and the layer deeper from a playoff perspective as well. I know I'm not going to go too deep on this, but just to remind everybody, like we're talking about it from the Brooklyn Nets perspective and saying, we know only so many games left, trying to get out of that play-in scenario, all that stuff. Philadelphia right now is 3 games back of Miami, whether or not they're going to push hard to get that 1 seed because knowing where Brooklyn is and what those matchups could look like potentially, but they're also in a virtual tie with the Milwaukee Bucks right behind them and only a game and a half ahead of Chicago. So all of the intensity about this game on a micro level right in front of you is there, in between these players is there. And then Brooklyn, yeah, they have everything they need to play for every single game, but Philly also has a lot to accomplish over the remainder of their season as well. I think in some regards, you take that off the table because they have Harden, because they've looked so good. Now it is about that championship, but they still have things they want to accomplish between now and the playoffs as well, which it's easy to be from the inside looking out as opposed to from across the way coming back to it and how important this game could be to them for very different reasons.
Yeah, this is like, again, this is the recipe for it. They just have everything's just sort of lining up along these lines, right? It's not just the one thing. Like I mentioned 9 different things already about just why it's so important for both of these teams. And if you're Philly too, and this will be the last high level thing before we start talking about the individual players, if you are Philly too, besides just all of the other storylines that go with this around Harden, around Embiid, around wanting to, the thing with Kyrie and KD, if you are Philadelphia and you can be responsible for making it much, much harder for the Nets to even make the playoffs, like you are very incentivized to do that. That'll be the theme for the rest of the season with every team they play, is that they are going, at least playoff teams, are going to be very incentivized. If you can take care of it now and make it much harder now, that will be much better than during a 7-game series, possibly sometime later in the playoffs.
Oh, 100%. So we'll start talking about what it's been to see Harden from afar playing with the Sixers and the impact that he's had on them. Talk about some of the other players on really both sides of this matchup and how it could play out Thursday night here. But first, gotta tell you about AG1 from Athletic Greens. It's been an absolutely fantastic addition to my daily routine, and that's because I'm trying to get healthier. And I want to find a way to maximize all of the positive things I'm putting into my body. Normally in the mornings, I get a piping hot cup of coffee and I try to kick on with my day. Instead, I've started taking one scoop of AG1, throwing it into a nice cup of water, stirring it up. And with that, I'm getting 75 high quality vitamins, minerals, whole food source superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens that help me start my day off on the right foot. It's basically a super dose of vitamins and minerals and everything that you maybe try to find through all these different products throughout your day and food sources. No, one scoop, get it in before I even think about having my breakfast. And all of a sudden it gives me a boost of energy. It gets me charged up. It boosts my immune system. It's actually been fantastic. When you think about some of the ways that you go about trying to get healthy, this is a really easy way to get everything in right in the morning, kick your day off in a positive way. AG1, of course, is also something that you can send over to your friends, your family. You can say, hey, you're looking to get healthy, coming off of a flu bug that's been circulating around. Go ahead and fold AG1 from Athletic Greens into your daily routine. You will not regret it, of course. And you can head over to their website right now to get in on all these fantastic offers from AG1 from Athletic Greens.
And when you're done with that, head on over to betonline.net, the number one spot for all of your sports betting needs. Philadelphia -4 right now over Brooklyn heading into that game. Yuck. That's okay. We'll turn that around, make that into a little bit of an upset. BetOnline's got all your latest odds, totals, player performance props, even where the next coach might be fired, might be looking toward the offseason with that one. BetOnline remains the best spot for all your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. It's not just basketball, although we're heading into March, and you know that's going to mean college basketball also getting hot and heavy here. We've also got hockey, boxing, UFC fight nights as well. Head on over to betonline.net today. Use your mobile device and learn about the trends and action they have going on over there. Don't wait. Bet online, where the game starts.
So, of course, then, beyond the hype, the pomp and circumstance around this matchup, then it is James Harden joining the Sixers and what that looks like to have him on that team with Joel Embiid. I mean, we can talk about what he's meant for Joel Embiid. I think that's I don't say easy, but it feels like the low hanging fruit around. Yeah, it makes his job a lot easier. Doesn't have a lot of the pressure. James Harden is the best facilitator that he's had with him in his entire NBA career. So you expect that impact to come here. Unless you have something you want to touch on first, I went right to Maxey on this one because this was a big component of this trade discussion. Nets wanted to get some of the younger talent that the Sixers were dying to hang on to. Now, while they end up getting Seth Curry and they get Drummond, and we feel like that's a really positive impact in the short term for the Brooklyn Nets, Maxey, from a statistical standpoint, I took the last 4-game sample size from him compared to the previous month. He's knocking down his field goal percentage 5% higher than he had been the month before. He's knocking down his three-point shooting. That's just jumped by 10%, almost 51%. I'm sorry, 61% over the start of March. Everything about his game and the fact that he's also someone you look at it on the defensive end has become exponentially easier because James Harden is there and the scoring threat that he's become. You have to assume that this is what Doc Rivers and Daryl Morey, this is what they were envisioning, the immediate impact of the individual talent of James Harden, and then how it would elevate some of these other players, especially in the short term, about winning a championship this year. Maxey looks like he's the prime example.
Yeah, there was a play in the first game when they played the Knicks, and it was the first game that Harden was on the team. And there was a play where Harden had the ball at the top of the key, and Maxey was in the corner, looking like he was going to be like sort of a spot-up corner three-point shooter at the time. Whatever, Harden we know can be ball dominant at times, often, and sometimes you're not sure what we're going to do. And when you have Embiid on the court too, like the defense is going to be really hard to set in place. And Maxey, the defender that was on Maxey shaded like one half step too close to Harden on a move that Harden made. And Maxey, they fed him the ball in the corner, and Maxey blew by this guy like he was Usain Bolt at the Olympics and dunked on the baseline. And I was like, oh crap. Like I've known Maxey was going to be really good. We're not going to put him at superstar level stuff here, but that play, I was like, right, this is going to be a real problem because he can play off ball here. He'd been playing a lot of on ball because they need to be the point guard. But at the off ball stuff is going to be like this. And that's just one play. Like, but he's getting tons of great shots. He's been amazing. The stats, you want some like on court stuff here. The Maxey, Embiid, Harden minutes. Now it's not a ton. It's 117 minutes. It's not been against like the best teams in terms of defense, but you got a Miami in there. You got you got Chicago, you got Cleveland, New York twice. Offensive rating in those 117 minutes is I just had it in front of me. I just clicked off. It was 135. 135
sure.
and 117 minutes. Defensive rating 105, a 29 net rating in 170 minutes, and it's not totally a fluke. Is Maxey going to shoot 61% from 3? No, but obviously not. But the part where like this is a real sort of three, like a group of 3 superstars, I'm gonna say threesome, like a group of 3 superstars, is a real thing. And the numbers, look, dude, we knew this about Harden. We knew that Harden could do this from guys. Like he did this exact thing for the Nets last year.
Yep.
Like when he is dialed in, he makes everyone better. We saw it firsthand. And so it's just not a surprise. The numbers are just off the charts.
No, it's what you would anticipate, obviously, from an in-game standpoint. How do you see in the absence of Ben Simmons? Because now I start to think about what is that matchup going to look like in the grand scheme of things. It comes down to a playoff matchup, and Ben Simmons is on the court. We love the idea of seeing Ben Simmons take on James Harden and try to lock him down defensively. But in the absence of that, and for this game, who is going to try to pick up that task on him? And then I want to get into what the Nets are going to try to do against a player like Embiid, who, while a unicorn unto himself, still represents a big-bodied shooting 5 that the Nets in any matchup have to specifically figure out how are we going to approach this, knowing how dangerous he can be.
Yeah, look, without Simmons, this is a matchup problem for the Nets for sure. There's really no way around it. They have 2 dynamic guards that play very differently from each other. Like one is like great in transition. We've already seen him shoot. We just spent the whole time talking about Maxey, and we already know what Harden is. Like these are 2 dynamic guards that you're going to have to contend with. The Nets' point of attack defense right now is not great beyond Bruce Brown. Like we've talked before, Ben Simmons solves a lot of this in theory. So not having him in this game definitely hurts. This is a game where you could see these 2 guards really, really give them trouble. And like, it's just because like when Harden's dialed in, he is among the very best players in all basketball. So it's not that we just didn't necessarily see that in the last little stint that he had for the Nets for obvious reasons, or for whatever the reasons ended up being. But that switch has clearly flipped since heading down the turnpike. Yes. I mean, it's total night and day. He's been like MVP levels since he got to since he got to Philly. This is gonna be hard. This is gonna be hard for the Nets. Like when it's basically Kyrie, Seth Curry, and Bruce Brown having to deal with these 2 dudes. We'll talk about Embiid, like, and also having to just worry about how much Drummond can handle against Embiid early.
Yeah.
This is not an ideal matchup for the Nets. Like they don't, at least personnel wise, they're going to have to try to outscore them. And that's going to be very hard against a team that has, when those 3 guys are playing, like literally no problem scoring.
Yeah, I want to see it. And at least in this moment, you'd say, well, let's use Bruce Brown on James Harden, right? He's the best opportunity you have defensively. But then because you don't have Ben Simmons yet, how many possessions will it take before, as good as Bruce Brown can be defensively, he gets into some foul trouble? Once you take him off the court, now you don't have any of those defensive options. And to your point, it's probably a relative footnote around trying to slow down James Harden versus let's just try to outscore them and live in those waters. But the other piece that I'll just throw out as a high level thought around this is I prefer the Nets to try to play a little bit of, like we said this when James Harden was a Net. So I'm not critiquing his game now that he's on another roster. James Harden's perimeter shooting is not the best first part of his game that you want him to utilize. It doesn't mean that he can't catch fire from the outside. Doesn't mean he can't be dangerous. But if I was the Nets, I'd be trying to play some level of sagging defense, providing some help towards Embiid for Drummond so he doesn't get into the early foul trouble, because you're probably going to be without LaMarcus Aldridge again in this one. You're already going to be thin there. And living with the idea of let's try to stay at home on Maxey and maybe entice James Harden to play out on the perimeter as much as possible, because it at least says we're taking away the drive and penetration that he maybe wants to do. We're taking away double teaming and blitzing and leaving Maxey with some of those wide open looks. Like, as difficult as it may sound, we talked about it in the matchup how the Hornets try to approach Kyrie Irving and sending double teams when Kevin Durant's having an off night. I don't know if you want to be sending blitzes at James Harden and then setting up. And we don't even talk about Tobias Harris, right? Just setting up perimeter guys that are capable of knocking down these looks. I don't think you want to get into those waters because the Nets have struggled mightily on 3-point defense over the last 10 games or so. They have been absolutely abysmal there. The switches have been difficult, the rotations have been difficult. So I try to simplify it and just work into the idea of this is where the danger is going to come from. Live with the results, but let's try to make it as in front of us as possible.
Yeah, you're definitely in pick your poison territory for sure. I don't think I would just like allow James Harden to operate freely around the 3-point line. So I'd probably
No,
push back on that. I don't know if it changed your mind. He's shooting 45% from three since he went to Philly. So it's another thing that he's like been able to basically solve also.
and I more mean
so,
like I more mean live with the one-on-one matchup of if you're going to put Bruce Brown
gotcha.
on him,
I
he's
understand.
out on the perimeter. He tries to take him on and crowd his space, but let's not worry about the second blitzing defender, right? Let's not worry about leaving the lane as opposed to say having Kevin Durant playing 1 foot in the lane, giving some help on Embiid and trying to congest some of those passes that Harden wants to get down low to Embiid, and live with the secondary options that Harden has to choose from.
And it's good. Well, it's not good, but in some ways, the Nets solved this problem for themselves because they don't really have good personnel to do it anyway because their guards are so small. So like you don't even
Right.
get really helped by bringing like a lot of help defense at the top of the key because Harden's just bigger than all those guys,
Blitzing
and
Patty
so
Mills isn't going to really
it's
ruffle
Curry.
anyone's
He's bigger
feathers.
than Curry, Irving, and Bruce Brown. Like I'm
Yep.
pretty sure he's bigger than Bruce Brown. So like I don't even know what you. I don't even think you solve too much like by being able to do that. I think you're just gonna have to live with it. I think you're just gonna have to live with whatever he is able to do. Like I said, this is tough. Like there's it's hard to scheme against this. These are two of the top. And when they're playing their best, these are like easily two of the top 10 best players in basketball in Embiid and Harden. And unfortunately, two dudes that like the current Nets personnel does not match up great with. No one really matches up great with Embiid, but like again, Simmons. We'll talk about. I guess we'll talk about Simmons here in the end. But like this is where the Simmons. You would love to. Again, we're gonna say this to every game until he comes back. Like you would love to have Simmons here.
Right. What would really help in this spot? A Ben Simmons. Thankfully, he's on the roster, just not on the court yet. Let's get into some more of the rotation talk here right after we tell you about our friends over at Rock Auto because we know there's so many parts in your car. Doug, how many car parts are there in an average vehicle?
89.
Yep, you know what? And it might be a few more. It's probably closer to thousands, but the bottom line is I don't know all of them. I like to consider myself a bit of a do-it-yourself expert at home. You get into an auto parts store, you ask them for something you need, they walk back into the dusty aisles, they come back, hand you a part. You don't know if it's right, year, model, make. We have no idea, friends, and you're spending a premium on all of those parts that you're picking up. You head over to rockauto.com, you're going to save yourself time and money. You punch in the make and model of your car, you know you're getting the right part, and you know you're getting it at a great price. You go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck right locked on in the How Did You Hear About Us box so they know that we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need, rockauto.com. So on the rotation side of it, I'll throw out this for the we talked about defending against Harden. Then you think about Embiid. I think it's important to try to throw some different bodies at him and just accept the fact that people are going to be picking up fouls here along the way. The problem is LaMarcus Aldridge has been dealing with a hip impingement. This feels like an interesting game from the standpoint of we have, or at least I feel I've been saying, the Nets are trying to refine rotations as they wind down here over the last 16 games of the season, so they know what they're going to be going into the playoffs with, knowing you're going to be adding in Ben Simmons. Do you see any wrinkles here in who the personnel is going to be in this particular matchup? Because I look at a couple of players on the bench that have not been getting time and think this actually could be a good opportunity to get a little minute share here and maybe switch up some of the James Johnson minutes and maybe look at how you're going to utilize Patty Mills in a game like this versus a Kessler Edwards, a Blake Griffin, like just in this swath of who you're going to throw out there. I think there's different options, and Nick Claxton. There's different options that the Nets and Steve Nash could choose to go with in this one to try to be a little bit more disruptive.
Yeah, this is the other hard part about how to deal with this grouping because in some ways, the Drummond trade actually, this is where the Drummond trade actually comes in to help you a little bit because they didn't have this guy on the roster.
Right.
I know they didn't have Drummond. They didn't have this type of player on the roster that's pretty specifically important to guard against teams that have traditional centers. And I'm just going to call Embiid that. I mean, he's non-traditional in the sense that he's amazing, but we saw it with Plumlee. Like, that's more of a traditional kind of center. It's easier for Drummond to stay on the court. In terms of just overall body size, the Drummond thing actually helps a lot here because you're able to throw him 1-for-1, especially with like Aldridge hurt now. Like, they don't have anyone behind him that can really effectively, honestly, even speed bump Embiid that much, just based on size. But fouls are clearly going to be an issue here. Since the trade, the Sixers lead the league in free throws, just by, just slightly over the Knicks. But they're pretty easily like at the top of this group, and it's easy to see why, right? Like, Embiid gets fouled a ton, Harden gets fouled a ton. They're probably going to lead the league in this number from here on out, and probably in the playoffs too, just by the nature of the way this team plays. And the Nets, unfortunately, the way they're currently constructed, they don't have a ton to go to with foul trouble now. Like, in terms of, I mean, they have a few offensive options like Dragic and guys like this that can come in off the bench, and Patty Mills. But the key players that could seemingly get in foul trouble here, whose primary defensive assignments are going to be the two best players in Embiid and probably and James Harden with like Bruce Brown, they don't have a lot of backup right now, like coming after it. So I think that's a key that we need to watch here is like how quickly, but probably how quickly fouls become a problem for the Nets.
So this leads me to a couple of these guys, and I was having an active thought on it. One would be Blake Griffin, and this is a both short and long-term thing. I'm not 100% sure if Blake Griffin is done having a role for this team, or if this is just about
he'll play in this game.
Yeah, well, right. So let's just, in this game, I'd say, hey, why don't you go ahead and get yourself beat up a little bit by Joel Embiid? Have some fun. It's going to be brutal, but eat some of those fouls that we want to keep off of Drummond, that we want to keep off of. Now, to my next point, a guy like Nicholas Claxton, who, if it's me, and we're thinking about, we always talk about his defensive versatility, can defend whatever, 2 through 5, 1 through 5, however you want to label it. I would try to utilize Nicholas Claxton away from Joel Embiid and go ahead and live with some of the results, sending him out on James Harden on the perimeter on those switches so that you can eat some fouls off of Bruce Brown potentially. Like, that's, I think, the game that the Nets want to play here as far as how to handle these two players. And I would utilize them in that vein. Like, I would use Nicholas Claxton, keeping him off of Embiid, because that's a death sentence for him. I think we talk about the physicality, the size, the presence. I'll let Blake eat some innings and frustrate underneath the basket of Joel Embiid, hit him hard, try to beat up his body. Same thing for Drummond. Like, that's all you're looking to do here. And the most important component of this is keeping guys like Dragic, like Seth Curry, like Patty Mills, like Kyrie Irving, keep them clear of foul trouble so that they can keep trying to lift things with Kevin Durant on the offensive end, right? Like, it's as much about avoiding fouls there so you can continue to be effective on the other side. So we talk about fatigue factor and putting in, the work at both ends. In this particular game and matchup, I like the idea of, here is our defensive-minded unit that's going to eat fouls and be physical there, to let everyone else do what they can on the offensive end and make, at some point, hopefully, Philadelphia have to chase you and get into some of those perimeter looks that we talked about.
Yeah, this is, like, again, I can't harp on this enough. This is a strategic sort of nightmare for the way the team is currently constructed. Only because, and I hate to say that, and Simmons is going to be there. He's going to be on the bench. Good for him for going to the game. He's going to take a ton of shrapnel here coming from the crowd, for sure. So, and he's going to sit there and just have to deal with it, and that's just going to be the way that it is. But obviously, he's not playing. So his versatility does cure some of this stuff. They're just not going to have it for this game. I'm mostly with you. I want to see them get out in transition as much as possible. I think they can really, they need to try to push the pace. I think, like, trying to play a half court game against the Sixers time and time again is going to be a really big problem. It's really important that they're able to get set in their defensive sets. Like, making baskets is going to be critical, because that allows them to at least set their defense. Like, not being able to set your defense against this team is also a death sentence. So it's going to be, like, I hate to say, like, a good defense is a good offense, or the best defense is a good offense here. Right. It kind of will be that case for the Nets in this game, I think.
And any Bruce Brown, Nicholas Claxton, Andre Drummond, Blake Griffin, if he's in the game, anything floaters, those little shots in and around the basket offensively, they have to go in. You can't have the unfortunate bounce where they don't fall, to your point exactly, around the transition offense for the Sixers. Out the door on this, we said about the last game, it was so pivotal and critical for the Nets to beat the Charlotte Hornets for what it meant in the standings. Understanding they don't have Ben Simmons, does this still have the must-win mentality for the Brooklyn Nets? Because you mentioned it about, they can't turn off that approach to games. Every game, we need it. Does it matter as much if they lost this game to Philly without Simmons, as opposed to some of these lesser opponents we know they have lined up along the way here and securing that playoff seeding?
I'd contend like every game that Durant and Irving play together, they have to win.
Mm.
Like the way the way things are going right now, with the mandate not going to be revoked, and it's not going to get easier when they go back to Barclays because of the personnel necessarily. Even though some of the games might be easier, I would put it at every game that you have these guys together. I mean, nothing's ever, I guess, a must win, even though we've called multiple games must wins. Because there's always more games in the season. It will be very disappointing. Every game that they're together that they do not win is a disappointment. I'll put it that way. And like I think that it's like the most succinct way I can think of to describe feelings about going into this one.
Sorry, I'll give an extra question too. Right now on paper, without Ben Simmons, should the Nets be able to beat the 76ers? This team, these two teams you're going to see tonight, should they be able to beat that team in a 7-game series? Like, would you look at that on paper and say, Kyrie Irving, Kevin Durant, you should be able to win a 7-game series against this team?
They would be the underdog. I would struggle to bet on them. Like they would be the clear underdog, I think. But this team right now would be a pretty clear dog to and that would be assuming like Kyrie was available for all 7 games or whatever.
Yes. Yeah.
I would, no, I would still, the Sixers would be a pretty healthy favorite, I think. Simmons changes that, but that's just the honest assessment. I don't think, I don't think I would get much pushback in NBA circles. Okay. We're going to get,
Could be good.
well, yeah, that's gonna be great. We'll be here right after this game on Thursday night. We'll be recording, directly after the final buzzer sounds, because I'm sure we'll have a million thoughts. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe over on YouTube to the Locked On Nets YouTube channel. Like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts.
In preparing for battle, I have always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. Dwight D. Eisenhower.
Oh, DDE. One of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.